Hello, everyone. Parior, Pari Luis, Pari Ereko. I know we have a lot of people joining from very different parts of the world, and from Gyumri to our lecturers from America. And for some of them, it's very, very early, and it's a very hot early evening in London. So welcome everyone who is not sitting in their garden but joining us. I'm Photographic. I'm the director of the Armenian Institute, and we have a delightful event today for you about Zabelle Panosian, a fantastic singer whose work has been brought to us and elevated and talked about by Ian Nagoski, Harout Arakelian, and Harry Kezelian. Before I introduce our guest, just a bit of housekeeping. Everyone is on mute, as you might have realized, but please ask your questions in the chat and we'll share them and we'll try to answer them with all of our participants. The event is being recorded, so hello everyone who is watching on YouTube later on. If you don't want to be seen, please turn your videos off. We will be sharing some links in the chat as an information about the book we're talking about and the Zabel Panosian music. So keep an eye on the chat as well, and feel free to share your comments, questions, and ideas with us. So let's start with my guests. Ian's name, I think I first came across on Twitter following his Canary Records imprint. Ian is a music researcher and he's a reissue record producer in Maryland. He's joining from Maryland today. He specialized in early 20th century recordings by immigrants to the US and has produced albums for many labels, including his own Canary imprint. Ian has spoken about his work with in Europe, in America, for many institutions, including Library of Congress, University in Chicago, etc., etc. We're very honored to have him here. And most importantly, he's incredibly passionate about music. So, and hopefully we'll hear all about it from him. Harout Arakelian has already spoken for AI this January, I think, at our music conference. So a good friend of Armenian Institute. He's a video editor, music collector, and researcher based in Los Angeles. I loved reading Harout's bio because it said he's working on collecting every known commercial recording from the 78 RPM era, roughly from 1890s to 1950s, which estimates to 1,200 phonograph discs. This fantastic thing you're doing, Harout. I think I can see everyone's faces smiling and in awe. So we hope you get to whatever you're trying to do. And Harout's long-term vision is to provide all audio as well as all research documentation to be digitally accessible, which is, all of us will agree, it's so important. And Harry, who we are very excited to have, and Harry says it's his first Zoom lecture, so welcome to our first Zoom lecture. We, of course, many of you, our Armenian friends, will know Harry's name from Armenian Mirror Spectators. He's a fantastic writer. Please go and search for his articles there. He's based in Detroit. He's a very active member of Armenian-American community. And he's trained as a historian, so his approach to music comes from the lens of history. His great-grandparents were a part of initial wave of Armenian immigration from the Ottoman Empire to the US. And his own mission is to learn all about kef music, which is wonderful, delightful joy music, party music, if you don't know what kef means. He's also a vocalist and a wonderful oud player, as my colleague Anushka Berberen had just witnessed in person in Detroit last week. And Harry's own goal is to publish a book on the history of music, as well as kef music, not all music, or maybe all music, and as well as to carry the genre forward. And most importantly, he views his work as a service to the Armenian community. So these are our guests, and I'd like to thank to my colleagues who helped to organize this event, our program manager, Narne Vlasian, and our graphic designer, Anushka Berberian. And I'll stop talking now and invite Ian to start his talk.
Hi, everybody. Can you all hear me okay? Yes, thumbs up. I'm seeing nodding. Okay, good. All right, so my name is Ian Nagoski. I'm in my basement here in Baltimore, Maryland. Sorry, it's such a mess. We're going to be talking today about a singer that we published a book about recently called Zabelle Panosian. It comes with a CD of all of her recordings. She was active as a recording artist between 1917 and 1918, but had actually a long, interesting career. And what I'm going to do to begin is just give you about a half an hour of talking about her biography and her career as an artist. So I'm just going to commence with that. She was born in 1891, thereabouts, with the name Takui Dermazropian in a place called Bartizak, which is an entirely Armenian-speaking town, about 80 miles, 150 kilometers, almost due east from Constantinople, Istanbul. Bartizak was 10,000 people who had arrived several hundred years earlier from further east. There's I want to recommend, if you're interested, a very good book, written in the early 20th century and published about 7 years ago by the Gomidas Institute about Bartizak. The translator of this book was very helpful in explaining some things about the town to me. The town was surrounded by mulberry groves and had 2 silk mill productions at either end. And that was the main income for the town. They remained entirely Armenian speaking by a combination of discretion and bribery, where Ottoman Turkish officials would be invited in on a regular basis, once a year or something, fed a good meal, and then an envelope with some cash in it would be passed along to them, and they would be discreetly asked, oh, would it be okay, maybe you would want to say to our Turkish neighbors that it would be better for their souls not to be around us infidels. Don't you think that would be a good idea? And they, okay, yes, sure, fine. So in that way, it stayed autonomous and independent, really, for a very long time. This is where Zabel grew up. She was educated right in the middle of Main Street, sang in the chorus in church, Sor Hagop, there in the middle of the Main Street. When she was 8 years old, the first bad thing happened. Her mother died. We don't know how or why. And then when she was 11, the second bad thing happened, which is that she was taken from her bed at night as a child and put on horseback by Turkish military men, ridden off and made to sing and dance on tabletop for them. She was returned home safely, we hope. It's a story she told twice. And then at 15, the third bad thing happened, which was there was another abduction attempt. Her father and some family friends got in the way and were able to keep her safe. But that incident apparently is what convinced their family to send her away. In the spring of 1907, at 15 years old, she was packed off and shipped to Egypt. She probably only had an internal passport. Armenians were generally not allowed at that period to have passports to travel overseas because of revolutionary activities. So she was shipped off, went to Egypt. Family friends apparently there got her passage to the US, to Boston, where she was married June of that year, 1907, to a guy apparently from her town, from Bartizak, named Harout Panosian, who was about 10 or 15 years older than her. He was, right about that time, hired by the Tickner Brothers Postcard Company, who were successful innovators in the field of picture postcards in the United States. And he did quite well. And he was very supportive of her, got her English speaking lessons and got her singing lessons. They had a child almost immediately after Zabelle's 18th birthday. Her first singing lessons were with guys named Hooker and Graham, who she said she learned nothing from. And then with a woman named Gertrude Duena, with whom she said she learned the delicacies of the art of singing. It was at the same time the case that America was in the grips of opera fever. There were two opera houses functioning in New York City. One sprung up right about that time in Chicago, one in Philadelphia, and one in Boston. They were living in Somerville, which is kind of an industrial suburb north of Boston. It's pretty well integrated into the city now, as you know. And so this Boston Opera Company was set up by a guy named Otto H. Kahn, who was a wealthy Jewish philanthropist, banker. If you know the Marx Brothers movie Animal Crackers, he's Roscoe W. Chandler, is the parody of him in that Marx Brothers movie. Anyway, and he set up this opera house where the best singers, not just in America, in the world, came and sang. She may well have seen Nellie Melba, Luisa Tetrazzini, Emily de Gallicurci, really high level singers. Now, the Boston Opera Company only ran like 4 years. Boston was, after all, something of a cultural backwater compared to a place like New York City. And the opera company was quite well documented. For the rest of her life, Zabelle said she was of the Boston Opera Company. To the best of my knowledge, she was not. But who's going to check, right? Showbiz. You can say what you want. But apparently, if she ever had a role that was like a walk-on in the chorus where she got to put on a costume or something, but was never credited in any programs. But she fell in love with that music at the time. The coloratura bel canto singing of the late 19th and early 20th century was the most glamorous part of showbiz, at least in America, certainly much of the world. And she was deeply attracted to that and became quite serious about it with her ongoing studies. She began singing publicly 1912, 1913, thereabouts. By 1914, she was popular enough within the Armenian community in the Boston area, of whom there were thousands of people, that she had to take an ad out in a newspaper forbidding people from using her name in events that she was not actually singing at. So that's some measure of popularity. She was then kind of in her early 20s, I guess. So then, 1914, 1915 through 1919, as the genocide is taking place and reports are coming in, she begins giving benefit concerts for Armenians and wound up raising an enormous amount of money personally from appearances as a performer and by appearing at, lending her name and her celebrity to various benefit efforts of various kinds. The way that it happened in Bartizak was that by April 24th, 1915, all of the guns had been taken away from Armenians in Bartizak. All of the men had been put to work, conscripted into military service, building roads and things. And then the government took all of the Armenian leaders of the village and took them off and beat them, caned them. So physical violence. Everybody knows that physical violence is on the table if you don't submit to what's going to happen next. What was going to happen next is that everyone was informed, you're going to take all of your possessions, all of your furniture, all of your rugs, everything you own, drag it out onto the street, and the neighboring villagers, Turks largely, are going to be able to come in and buy all of your stuff for whatever they want to pay, a pittance. And you're then going to have to pay that money to the government for them to deport you for your train fare, one train to another train to another train to Syria and the march. Zabelle later learned that her father died of starvation We don't know if it was during the genocide, but that's my best guess. 3 of her siblings, a sister and 2 brothers, made it to the United States shortly after she did. This period of fundraising in the US coincides with a meeting in 1915 with another singer, a guy named Armenian-American. Shamaradian was the most significant vocalist for Armenians, certainly in America, during the early 20th century. He's a guy that had already been studying with Gomidas Vadarpet, end of the 19th century in Georgia, had been imprisoned for revolutionary activities a couple of times, been released, spent a couple of years living in his hometown, teaching choral music, and then made his way to Paris, where he studied at the Schola Cantorum under Vincent d'Indy, and with an Armenophile composer in France named Viardot. She had a family that went back to Mozart. She was a little old lady at the time. She was born 1812. She gave him lessons for free. And he had his big break starring in, I think 1912, in Gounod's Faust at the Grand Opera in Paris, and became a star. Very well-paid celebrity, toured all over Europe. Early 1914, he goes to Constantinople, Istanbul, and visits again with his old friend, Gomidas Vadarpet. Gomidas Vadarpet, most of you, I expect, know, is the great patriarch of Armenian music. He was a composer, a priest, and an ethnographer, somebody who collected and published Armenian folk music. In 1914, in Constantinople, Istanbul, Gomidas and Shamaradian recorded a series of records, including one that I will play you momentarily. Anyway, early 1915, the war breaks out. Beginning of the First World War, Gomidas, or Shamaradian rather, can't get back to Paris because of the war. So he, his wife, and daughter all come to the United States, December 1914. Early 1915, he meets up with Zabelle Panosian. The 2 of them began doing benefit concerts in Syracuse, Detroit, some other places. And over the course of the next 4 years, both of them are very, very active, giving concerts in benefit of Armenian relief, sometimes together, sometimes separately. In the end of 1916, they both make trial recordings for the Victor Records Company in Camden, New Jersey. There are 2 main record companies before the Second World War in the United States, Victor and Columbia. They go to do a tryout for Victor, and they're both rejected. Victor had the Red Label series, which is the big classical label that Gallicerci and all these other people were singing for. So a few months later, March of 1917, Zabel goes to Victor's main rival, Columbia Records, New York City, at the Woolworth Building, then the tallest building on earth. And she records a handful of sides for them. One of them is a piece that she had been performing almost all of her concerts. It's a song many of you will know already, but it is her own version. It is specific to her, and it is a version that she said she learned from the lips of her countrymen. It is a Bartosag-specific melody for the song Grunk. Grunk, as Harry Kezelian has pointed out, is a song that was then already at least 300 years old. He found that the oldest surviving text of it is in Aleppo, and it is identical to the text that she sings here. The lyrics go, "Crane, where are you coming from? Have you any news from home? I am servant of your voice. Hasten not to your flock. You will arrive soon enough." I think I swapped 2 of those lines. Anyway, the record came out the end of 1917. That is the record that I encountered a dozen years ago through the gift of a collection from a guy named Leo Sarkeesian, whose family were from Haverhill, Massachusetts, after having arrived from Diyarbakir. Anywho, that record spoke directly and deeply to Armenians living in the United States in the aftermath of the genocide. It is an incredibly beautiful, powerful performance. And as Armenians are hearing news from home, they are wondering a lot. How bad is it? You know, is there anything left? Is there a home to go back to? Is everything destroyed? Is everyone I ever knew dead? So I'm going to play you that record now. It's one of the most beautiful things I've ever heard in my life, and is the reason that we started this whole project. I think it's worth hearing in its entirety. So this is Zabelle Panosian, March 1917 in New York City. It sold like crazy. It stayed in print continuously from the end of 1917 until 1931, when Columbia Records deleted their Armenian language catalog. Harry Kezelian found this article written called The Gardens of Our City, written by a genocide survivor in the 1930s, a guy named Harout Arakelian, who was born in 1903, where he describes a typical Armenian picnic in Van Cortlandt Park in the Bronx. He says, gradually the smoke of barbecued lamb would saturate the atmosphere and mix with other smoke of burning memories. At that point, joining this mixture would be the sonorous voice of Shamaradian singing Hayastan, pouring out of the throat of a morning glory horn gramophone. And then you would hear the grunk of Zabelle Panosian, and especially a Turkish language Anduni called Egen Havasi springing forth with sad fluctuations from the depths of Kemani Minas's soul. Those three records, Hayastan, Egen Havasi, and grunk, still remain among collections of that generation's records of Armenians in the US, the three that you find over and over and over again. I want to play you just very briefly some of the recording of grunk that was made by Shamaradian and Gomidas in Constantinople at the beginning of 1914. And one can, this is the version that most people know. This is the version that Gomidas collected in Eastern Turkey, Eastern Anatolia. And it is, as you will hear, rather different melody. And this is the one that's been performed most as a result of his work. Same text, different melody. So that's the one that one encounters the most. Now, although it was popular, that record of Zabel's, it was not universally acclaimed, or neither was she. I want to mention to you briefly a review of hers that was published by a guy named Krikor Prof. Kalafian, who's a figure that was, he was an elder statesman of Armenian music in the United States, born 1873 in Bursa. He's somebody that was thought of as being a kind of preposterously pompous, self-involved jerk. When he started a choir of his own in Fresno, California, the ethnomusicologist Sidney Robertson Powell pointed out that even the members of his own choir didn't like him. He was known to wear this top hat and this big mustache and present himself as like very important. Anyway, he wrote this review of a concert that he went to where Shamaradian and Panosian were singing together, where he points out, first of all, Zabel in concert was singing not just in Armenian, but also French, English, Italian. He had this to say about her performance. The madam sang in Armenian, French, and English songs, among which she had her greatest success with the Alla Turca version of the song Grunk. It is with boundless pain of the heart that I say this, because at this moment, when every single Armenian that wants to be Armenian is working, is striving to shake off from himself all the filthy traces of the large and small influence which the Turk has left upon us, at this moment when we are going to work to turn back to the Armenian faith and all of our holiness, that we have been subjected to the peril of the Turkified and Turkifying, at this moment when we have already vowed to liberate Armenian song from all its foreign introduced monstrosities and from the holy coupling of our Armenian mind and Armenian soul, we are awaiting the sacred conceptions of tomorrow's Armenian music. Just at this moment, I say it truly, it is not correct to still continue the old mistakes. It is not correct to immortalize these slaughters perpetuated by the Armenian Kanades, professional Ottoman singers, with this bizarre logic that our Armenian, and then here he uses terminology that Harry Kezelian can elaborate on, that basically means sort of stereotyped middle-class Armenians. Coming to Miss Z. Panosian's voice, it is delicate enough, although a little nasal, but it is very small for singing classical pieces, and I would honestly pray that the madam would dedicate herself to the cultivation of operetta singing, in which she could have great success. So, he ain't like her. Now, it's worth pointing out that that review came from between her two recording sessions, March 1917, June 1918. June 1918, she re-records several of the songs from her March 1918 material, including Grunk, and both versions were released. The second version of Grunk is in fact sped up on the disc and you have to slow it way down, but it turns out when you do slow it way down, her voice in that 14 months had improved drastically. She got a lot of bottom end in it and stuff. She worked, she doubled down and worked hard, and her voice got better and better and better, if the reviews are to be believed, really until 1926 or so. So I'll point out that there's another review from the Azak newspaper. Fellow says, just because you're popular doesn't mean you're good. While Zabelle Panosian's voice is beautiful, it is uncultivated as a flower in an untouched forest. Nature gave her the gift which needs to be cultivated to blossom to its full beauty if she focuses on European songs. This is what I thought when I accompanied her 3 years ago on piano, at 1916. So I went to the concert on Friday the 9th, and up until now, Zabelle was known for Armenian songs, which she sang in true Armenian style. The writer then focused on her English, and the reaction to Meyerbeer's Shadow Song was overwhelming. People applauded it more than the Armenian songs because she was able to display her vocal talents more. Her voice competed with the flute. Her technique was great. At one point, her voice and the flute were so harmonious that it was as if there were two flutes. On and on. And he says that Armenians like her voice, and it brings back memories of home. Now, was she a good singer or not? So she recorded 11 songs, 10 of them in Armenian, one of them in French. The French one that she sang appears as the B-side to some copies of one of her record, not all, and it's a song from a very minor opera called The Pearl of Brazil by Lucien David. It had been recorded less than a year earlier by Amelie de Gallicurci, identical arrangement in every single way. Zabelle's version is a cover of Amelie de Gallicurci's version. Luisa Tetrazzini had also performed it. So I'm just going to play for you very quickly the last minute of both of their performances of that same song, so you can find out, is Zabelle Panosian a good singer or not? So here's Gallicurci, who is 6 months younger than Panosian. Okay, and here's Zabelle singing exactly the same part of the song. Is she as good as Gallicurci? No, of course not. Nobody is. Gallicurci is incredible, but Zabelle's very, very good. And by the end of 1919, she is beginning to be accepted by the Western classical music establishment in the US. There are a couple of articles about her in the Musical Courier, which is kind of the voice of that scene. That's really the establishment. And she gets a gig in a biblical pageant play drawn from the Book of Kings, story of David and Solomon. She plays Abishag. So her career is progressing quite well, the end of 1919. Beginning of 1920, she gets a passport for her and her daughter to go overseas to Europe and to, she's hoping, Egypt and Constantinople to do music stuff and to find family. It was supposed to be for 6 months. It wound up being 3.5 years. She went first to England, performed in Manchester, and then set up at the Hotel Vernet in Paris by the Champs-Élysées, gave lots of concerts. She went to Cairo and Alexandria and performed, and then went to Milan, performed at La Scala, had a role in The Barber of Seville, which was received very, very well. After 3.5 years of being a celebrity of some renown, she comes back to the US with her daughter. And her husband then has a shop set up in New York City, and they are living at 183rd Street. At the end of her trip in Italy, she had begun using her husband's first name as her surname. So she was performing as Zabelle Aram. When she comes back to the US, she performs a couple of times using the name Zabelle Aram with the name Zabelle Panosian in parentheses in the Armenian press, but she basically just sticks with Zabelle Aram for the rest of her career. But I missed the most important point about the trip. The centerpiece of the whole book, the most important thing we accomplished by telling this story is something that happened right at the beginning. At 1920, when she was in Paris, one of the first things she did was to track down Gomidas Vadarpit and go visit him. What happened was that she was encouraged not to go. Gomidas had been arrested April 24th, 1915, and imprisoned by the Turks north of Ankara. I've forgotten the name of the prison there, and suffered from PTSD, from mental health problems for the rest of his life, hallucinations and delusions and depression. When he was released, he settled in a mental health a psychiatric facility in Constantinople, and then to Paris, where he lived the rest of his life at 2 different psychiatric facilities. She went and visited him at one of those. She was told not to go, that last week someone had come to visit and he had thrown his shoes at them. She was determined and came anyway with a couple of people, doctors. She was told not to say they were doctors because he hated doctors. They found him in the courtyard, kind of walking around and sort of talking to himself or something. And she told the story. She published an account immediately afterward. It is the only first person text that we have of hers still surviving. It is her as a researcher, her as a devotee of Gomidas's work, some of which she had recorded. And there's a number of interesting things about it. It's a very brief interaction. What wound up happening is he looks up and sees her and he says, "You remind me of one of my students." And she says, "Well, I am a student of yours, but from far away." He says, "Where?" She says, "Boston." He says, "Bostan," Turkish for vegetable garden. And it's uncomfortable and there's some sight. She, no. She doesn't say she's from Bartizak, where he had visited. She doesn't say that she's friends with Shamaradian, who he knew very well. She just says, I just wanted to ask you a question. The music that you've arranged for chorus, is it okay to sing that as a solo vocalist? And he says, "Yes, of course. My daughter, you're welcome to sing it however you feel is correct once you know the song." And so she sort of just takes her leave at that point and says, "We don't want to tire you out. We'll come back another time." And she takes her leave and says, he says, "Oh, okay, you come back and you sing for me and I'll sing for you." Apparently, she never went back. It's stressful to visit people who are mentally ill, and there's a stigma involved and stuff. But I wanted to say that that text, I believe, was found by Harry Kezelian. There's some controversy about who actually found the text. Harry translated it, and I wanted to kind of throw over to him momentarily to talk about that.
Sure. So I think Ian pretty much summarized the text. It's from a publication out of Paris called Verazanut, or La Renaissance, Armenian journal from Paris, and it was the editor is Dr. Leon Hampartsumian. I don't really know anything about the journal. Maybe some people on this call know about it, but in any case, I translated the text. And so what happens is she goes to the mental institution. She wants to see Gomidas, and she's with two gentlemen. One is a doctor named Dr. Nevruz, and I'm not really sure who he is. I believe he may have been one of these many Armenians from the diaspora who were traveling back to the Middle East in the immediate post-genocide period to try to like work as a doctor in the different orphanages or hospitals that were set up for survivors. There were several doctors that were trained in America that went and did that. One of them was also from Detroit, Dr. Avedis Kuyumjan, or Avedis K, and he was also involved in Zabel's story, as I might mention during my part. Dr. Nevruz seems to be one of these gentlemen. The other one is Harout Arakelian, who was a Armenian political activist, later a leading member of the Ramgavar party. At the time, he was under what was called the Veragazmial Hunchag, or the Reformed Hunchag Party, those who separated from the Hunchag Marxist party because they disavowed the Marxism. And they also didn't like Avedis Nazarbek, who was the Hunchag leader, who was seen as sort of like taking all the money for himself. And anyway, I don't want to get into the controversy of that, but in any case, she's with these two guys. And because of Nevruz being a doctor, they let her in, but then they pretend that he's not a doctor. And Gomidas obviously didn't like Harout Arakelian and looks at his face and says, I know this guy, that's that doctor that I don't like. And they have to say, no, Harout just came here from Boston. He's not have anything to do with the doctors here in France. So it was pretty humorous. It was a humorous story. And like Ian says, there's a joke about bostan, which in Turkish means like a kitchen garden or a vegetable garden. Because he says, Uskitse Kastigin, where did you come from? And she says, Bostonen, from Boston. And he says, basically like Boston Shadga, like why is it named Boston? Is because there's a lot of bostans or vegetable gardens there. And they're and they think that he's lost his mind. Maybe it's his humor and they don't know because they don't know him personally. Anyway, it's a very touching episode. And I believe that to me, and maybe my co-authors will disagree with me, but to me, there was a sort of an undertone of the fact that she was a female singer, she's attractive, and he sees her and he sort of has this reminiscence. And for me, it was a little bit of maybe he sees some of Margaret Babayan in her, who was known as his sort of close friend, companion. We don't really know their relationship that he spent a lot of time with. And there was kind of an undertone for that of that for me when I read it. But again, I could be wrong. And basically, it's a very touching, meeting where clearly she wants to learn from the great master and sort of approaches him like this almost demigod. And he is just very kind and, refers to her as Digin the entire time. Madam, or a married lady's title in Armenian, who's just very, very respectful. And they sort of speak to each other in very respectful Armenian, and she asks for his wisdom, and he basically tells her, I wrote this music for the singers that understand what I'm doing to be able to freely express themselves. It's not to be chained to the written transcription, to the written notes. And so, it's a pretty moving and I think historic, especially for the Armenian community, which reveres Gomidas so much, that this is a very, I don't know how many similar first-person accounts we have of Gomidas during his mental sanatorium time period. So, yeah, I think I've covered everything. With that, I think I'll just give it back to Ian.
Okay, yeah. So August 1923, she comes home. By the beginning of 1924, she rents out a couple of halls in New York City, big 1,000-seaters, and performs these concerts of her at her height. She's singing programs which are Italian, English, French, then Armenian. For each section, she wears a different costume. She is Zabelle Aram. There are a couple of different things going on culturally that had changed. First of all, there's an independent Armenian-American record business, and there's more material being recorded, not just for the major labels. She doesn't fall in with those labels. She also is experiencing maybe some of the wave of xenophobia that America was dealing with in the context of the Johnson-Reed Act, where immigration quotas were established, allowing only 120 Armenians a year to immigrate to the United States. From that point forward, it broke up families. But she continues to perform, although she gets management. She sings on the radio on a fairly regular basis, little short programs. And then she is singing for increasingly dwindling audiences and with other performers on the bill who are less and less serious kind of performers. She does a tour of California in 1926, during which there's a car accident, breaks a few ribs, goes into shock, but she's back on stage in less than a month. Yeah, I think she's really at her height about 1926 when the microphone is introduced, which unfortunately she never got to use. There are no more recordings. It's a shame, because it seems like her voice just got better and better. She was not particularly accepted and brought into the Western classical music establishment, to which she had some aspirations, I think. There are a couple of examples. She's brought up to Vermont to sing privately for a group of aficionados. But in any case, she and her daughter go back to Europe for a little time, end of the 20s, France and Spain. 1934, her daughter in her mid-20s does the same thing that Zabel did and founds her own career as a stage performer. Her daughter, Adrina. Adrina changes her last name to Otero, goes to Hollywood, appears in a series of short films starring a new comedian named Bob Hope, and then goes off to Europe and spends 1935 to 41 in England, France, Spain, Germany. The name that Adrina chose as her surname was Otero, after La Belle Otero, who was a Spanish courtesan and widely regarded during the Belle Epoque as one of the most beautiful women in the world. She represented herself for the rest of her career as Spanish. She very often told the press that her father was Spanish. She was born to a Spanish father and an American opera star in Boston, but that she was Spanish. So it's a complicated question having to do with a number of factors, one of which is the question of how well Near East relief worked in the United States, so that generations of Americans had in their head the idea that the word Armenian always followed the word starving. Because in this wave of philanthropy, donating money to Armenians after the genocide, it was just drilled into everybody's head, so that generations grew up being told, eat your vegetables, don't you know there are starving Armenians? So Armenian artists very often through the middle of the 20th century had the question of whether to identify as Armenians, and individuals made individual choices. Adrina Otero was a very popular flamenco dancer through the 30s. She modeled for a number of painters. Here she is in Berlin in 1937, when Roma people were being sent to the camps, representing herself as Roma, as a nightclub performer. Anyway, 1941, Adrina comes home, having fled, she missed, the Spanish Civil War is going on around her. She's staying with a friend of Franco's, who was a painter. She narrowly escapes the invasion of Paris by the Germans, makes it back home, and has a long career as a Spanish dancer in the United States, including multiple tours with the prima ballerina of the Metropolitan Opera, Marina Svedlova, with whom she had become quite close friends. She had a lot of contact with the Met Opera. Zabelle, meanwhile, her career fades out over the course of the 1940s and 50s. She does a little tour with her daughter of Argentina and Uruguay. But essentially by the 1960s, she's an older lady and is just appearing at like literary events and giving a few songs here and there. By 1972, when she is written about, if ever, it is in the past tense. Kathy Berberian, the great mezzo-soprano, who was a key figure in classical music in the United States in the 1960s, when talking to Charles Amirkhanian, pointed out that there was once an Armenian girl who was a big star singer, but she just faded out into nothing and nobody knows what became of her. In fact, Zabelle was alive and well in New York City still at the time. The generation of Armenians who had gone through the genocide and experienced it in the United States, I think in the middle of the 20th century, stepped back a little bit and didn't want to continuously think about, talk about, deal with the tragedy of the old days. There was a certain moving on that happened. And Zabelle's music and the period that she represented as the voice of that generation was less and less prominent for quite some time. So that by the time she died in 1985, she was quite forgotten. By that time, her husband was dead. All three of her American living siblings were dead. I think her daughter was dead. Actually, I'm not 100% sure. But immediately before she dies, 3 years before, in 1982, she donated to the Armenian General Benevolent Union $756,939. So that's the equivalent of almost $1.5 million now, in addition to all the money she raised in the 19 teens and 20s for Armenians. So she raised millions of dollars for Armenian relief. That number, the fact of that, incidentally, is entirely Harout's research. He found that. He also found that it was the third largest donation ever made to the AGBU up to that point. So that's the story. She's buried along with her daughter, husband, and her husband's mother in Astoria, Queens. I'm going to be going to visit the grave for the first time this week, and along with a couple of other significant locations. And with that, I'll hand it back over to Harry, who will did all the translations of all the lyrics in Armenian for the book, which is such an incredible contribution to music generally and the comprehension of this material, which I never would have had access to had it not been for him personally. So I wanted him to be able to talk to us a little bit about the repertoire and the meaning of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. First of all, I'd like to thank the Armenian Institute and for inviting us here. I'd like to thank Ian for asking me to be a part of this project. My role in this project, I feel, was sort of like a fact checker. Ian, I also did a lot of research. Ian, Harout, and I have shared the research, and through that time, I've tried to use my Armenian language skills and my history skills, whatever that might mean, to sort of basically kind of fact check and also do the translations of the songs. So I wanted to mention a few things. First of all, thank you, Ian, for your summarization and your very thorough explanation of Zabelle's career. I wanted to mention that a couple things. So I do think that Zabelle, for many people, represented like a voice of that era. I wanted to mention there's a magazine from Istanbul, Constantinople, called Haygin, and I believe Melissa Bilal is on this talk, and I believe she's very familiar with Hayganush Mark, who was the publisher of that periodical. And in any case, in the periodical, there's an article about her in 1919, and it's mentioned, just the first paragraph I'm going to read, it's very brief. Mrs. Zabelle Panosian is an Armenian talent who has received universal renown in the past 5 to 6 years. With her coloratura soprano voice, she's the only one among the Armenians who has been a true manifestation in America of the circumstances of the great Armenian Yerern, so genocide or depredation or crime, of 1915 to 1918. And then it gives a whole biography of her. In any case, it was like as if she represented the voice of the Armenians at the time. Another comparison I would make would be to the symbol of Mother Armenia. And at the time, those of you who are familiar with Armenian history and Armenian cultural history and Armenian literary history, today we think of Mother Armenia as this statue in Yerevan, this powerful woman with a sword. It kind of has a Soviet overtone to it. At the time, Mother Armenia was depicted as a woman, and it actually, I thought this was a picture of it, but it's kind of similar to this. But the lady has a harp in her hand. But in any case, it's a picture of a woman with sort of like disheveled hair and kind of she's sitting atop ruins, and it's supposed to be Mother Armenia is weeping upon the ruins, maybe of Ani or of Armenia in general, and she's weeping for her children. And there were depictions where some of this imagery is used to advertise Zabel herself clutching to children as their orphans, and almost like because she's raising money for the orphans in these charity concerts which she did, which were really sort of the most prolific part of her career. Because she's raising money for them, she's sort of like the Mother Armenia who's going to save them. And this is kind of the imagery that it's giving off. And in addition to the song Gurung that I'll mention in a second, the flip side of the Gurung record was Im Sireli Zavagunkus, which is like a semi-classical way of saying my beloved children. And so I have this book here. This is Joel Vertagan Yerkaran. It's a popular songbook published by Yeran Press in Boston. And the first edition was published, I believe, right before. There's not dates in it, unfortunately, but the first edition was published right before the First World War, because there are songs that are patriotic songs of the Ottoman Empire from the constitutional period after 1908, where there was a movement to believe that Armenians and Turks could be united, and Greeks and everyone else in the Ottoman Empire under one, as equal citizens. And there's songs about Hurriyet, Musavat, and what they were trying to copy the French, liberty, equality, and so forth into Turkish. And there's some songs about that in the first edition of the book. By the time you get to the third edition, those songs are gone. So clearly this edition came out after 1915. So it's during that period that this songbook was popular. And a lot of the songs Zabel sings are in this songbook. They were obviously songs that were popular at the time. One of them is the Im Sireli. And basically it says, Im Sireli Zavagunkus, Getaparin Odar Ashkar, Yes Urtimem Urpendrem, Gzarayen Ailots Honar. So my beloved children wander in the foreign world or in foreign lands. Where will I look for them? Where will I search for them? They are serving others humbly. So they've gone to other lands and they work there for the man, or whatever you want to call it. So come, my children, and visit your mother. It's the voice of Mother Armenia, and it's actually subtitled Hayastani Sukha, the lamentation of Armenia, personified Armenia, Mother Armenia, which is a personification of the land of Armenia or the nation of Armenia. So it maps on exactly to the imagery of that's being portrayed of Zabel in some of the advertisements that we've seen. And even I just noticed today, because I translated the first verse, because that's the only verse she actually sings, or the first two verses rather. But the last verse mentions the Gurung again. Isk tu Gurung im hayren yats, kanaheru achkesi pats, hedin vochchuin dur zavagats, zigyankis mech huise merads. And you, crane of my homeland, go far away, away from my eyes. Take the greeting to my children, that in my life my hope has died. So in this case, it's the Mother Armenia sending the crane to the immigrant Armenians or emigrant Armenians rather than the immigrant Armenian talking to the crane. These are very sad and kind of like depressing songs, and they were popular in the 19th century. Most of her songs are not the works of Gomidas. She does do a Garuna, which is a famous Gomidas piece. And even that song is very sad, actually, but she does do that one. And that's sort of a love song, supposedly, but I'm sure there's sad undertones to it. And maybe, again, someone like Melissa Bilal would be able to better explain the meaning of that. But just from my perspective, some of this basic stuff is that these are very sad songs, and they're patriotic songs. So it's talking about Armenia as a country for her children. It's talking about, there's a song, Zaindur of Zovag, which was written by the famous novelist Rafi, and set to music by a Russian composer, or maybe he was a Russian Armenian, I'm not sure, Grigory Kazachenko, what his background was. But again, it's a patriotic, nationalistic song. And it's sad, and it's talking about, the sorrows of the oppressed Armenians and the oppressed Armenia, this country of Armenia, which doesn't exist, by the way. As we know, there was no country of Armenia before 1918, going back to 1375. So this is part of the movement for autonomy or for creating a new nation state, which was felt by Armenians, and it had to do with the revolutionaries, and it's all the Armenian political movements of the 19th century. And of course, in Zaindur of Zovag, there's the line, Artyo Kaluye Miorja Manag, will one day, is it possible the day and time will come when on the summit of Ararat, a flag is seen, and from all directions, the exile of the Armenian nation will head toward their lovely homeland. So again, it's a sad thing, but then with this hope that somehow we're going to revive Armenia. Just real quickly, some of the others that are in here. Giligya is a very famous song we all know, again, from the 19th century. It was written by Dr. Rusinyan, the lyrics and the music by Yeranyan. And this is from the 1860s, and it's about Gilikya and depicting Gilikya as a new homeland for Armenians. It's sort of vague in the original, but as we know, in the wake of the First World War, there was the attempt to create an autonomous Gilikya. Some of the people Zabel hung around with were part of that. She did do, and that's why I mentioned about Harout Arakelian and being part of the Ramgavars or Veragazmials. The point is that she was part of these diaspora political circles. And there was, it was mentioned in the book, and unfortunately, we sort of made a mistake and we forgot to add a note in there about the context. But there was a series of concerts that she did with some representatives that came from Egypt to the United States. Miran Damadyan of the Ramgavars, and I think Sabak Yulian was with the Hunchaks, and the Tashnaks had a sort of a guy who wasn't as famous. I forgot his name. He wasn't a well-known, to my knowledge, of the Tashnak party. But anyway, they came to recruit soldiers to fight in what was called the Armenian Legion. Many of you may know there's a recent book by Dr. Patty about the Armenian Legionnaires, and how they had a deal with the French and British governments to create this legion to then fight the Ottomans under the, I'm gonna say it wrong, but I think under the French flag, but under British command. And they were part of the troops that, quote unquote, liberated Palestine from the Ottomans, giving it to the British control, and then marched north into southern Turkey, which is called Gilikya by Armenians, and occupied it under the French flag with this help of this Armenian Legion, who were recruited from the United States, by the way. Like I said, that's why Zabel was at the recruiting concerts for this, essentially, and singing at those concerts, and also from Port Said in Egypt, where the refugees from Musadah were located. And so this fighting force went there, and they so-called liberated Gilikya, and they encouraged people to go back. In fact, my great-grandmother was one of the people who went back, quote unquote, went back She wasn't even from there. She was from Sivas, Sebastia, and they went and lived in Aintab for a couple of years because the idea was to repopulate the land of Cilicia and give it autonomy for Armenians. So Zabel is like kind of part of all this stuff. Now, whether she really has a lot of political influence or ideas herself, I don't know. But she's definitely being, her skills are being utilized by the Armenian political circles for their purposes, whether it's a political movement like that, mostly for charitable work. And she's being viewed as this, I think she's being viewed as this symbol of the struggle. There's a couple more songs I wanted to mention. I mean, some of these are just really sad. Toch Cherke Bulbul, Let the Nightingale Not Sing in the Plains of Mush. And why? But it's because obviously there's been massacres there. Some of these songs, Chavar Eliem, I'm Darkened Like the Night. They're all sad, basically, almost all of them. Gilikia is kind of a hopeful song. Der Getso is a very famous song that's like a prayer, but it's kind of like very bitter and talks about like pummeling the enemy, because I guess the context is that the Armenians have been so downtrodden. That's a very early song from the mid-19th century. A lot of these songs were from a time when Armenian music was not, I think, so much under the influence of Gomidas and under the influence of Armenian folk music. These were sort of pseudo-European compositions with Armenian political or patriotic messages written in kind of semi-classical Armenian. And it's a style of music that you don't hear too much after the genocide, from what I've seen. But during the time, I think these were some of the only songs they had to express the grief they were feeling. That's my sort of interpretation of it. Why Zabel is singing these songs in 1916 and 1917, 1918. And then finally, her most famous, Gurung, and also another one, Mir Khor Babga Keresman, which is another song about Bantucht. Bantucht in Armenian means an exile or a migrant worker, or there's a lot of different meanings to it. Wanderer, I guess it could mean an emigrant. And again, I found in this book, so the Merkhor Babka Keresman, which, and actually I might be mistaken about this. I think it means our father's grandfather's grave, but maybe Babka means in this dialect means something else. It's written in a dialect that's sort of similar to Mush or maybe Van dialect. I think it's kind of artificial. I think it's maybe written in the city to try to imitate their dialect. And it's titled Gigon I Kasim Pasha. Kasim Pasha, meaning Gigo is in Kasim Pasha. Kasim Pasha is a neighborhood in Istanbul where there's a lot of migrant workers. And I believe Vaskin Tavitian helped me with learning about that region of the city. Gigo was a name that was a lot of times used for like a stock figure of a provincial Armenian who migrated to Istanbul. And it's used in a lot of contexts in the late 19th century. Somebody who knows Armenian literary history can go into it more detail, but basically it's a song written about how this Gigo, or whoever he is, has left his homeland. Let's say it's in Van or Mush, and he's left his grandfather's grave there and his family. And there's all these verses that Zabel doesn't actually sing the whole thing. But it's about exile and migration. And so again, it maps onto the experience of Armenians in America who are totally away from even the Ottoman Empire, let alone from what village or city they were from in Eastern Anatolia. And then Gurung, of course, is such a famous song. It's a song that has long been known to many Armenians and basically goes back to the 17th century, if not before. It's a song that is well known in the version that Gomidas Vartabed published. By the way, I don't think it was collected in Eastern Anatolia. I don't know if there's evidence for that, unless it was in Kars, which is now part of Turkey, but at the time was part of the Russian Empire. So I'm not sure where Gomidas got his version from. Again, maybe Dr. Bilal can help us with that. But but certainly Zabel's version is very interesting, and it's one of a kind. I've heard some other versions or seen sheet music of other versions similar to hers, but I am guessing that they were copying her, or they heard it from her, or maybe they came from the same region, and that's how it was sung in the region of northwestern Anatolia. Again, I'm not expert enough to say that answer, but we do know obviously it's a different melody. It's in a musical mode that's more similar to a Western minor scale rather than a augmented scale like the famous gurung is, that's in this sort of, in Armenian church called kimtsa, or in Keth music we call it hijaz, which is a very common scale in Armenian folk music as well, and in that song particularly. But gurung is about, for those who don't know about gurung, briefly, in the Middle East, the cranes migrate from the north to the south for the winter. And so in the original lyrics of gurung, it's depicting an Armenian immigrant who's living in either Syria or Iraq area. And they basically see this crane that migrates from the north, which is where Armenia is located, to the region that they're in. And they're saying to the crane, basically, I'm dying to hear any news of what you have and what you can tell me from the homeland, from our country, Mer Ashkara. And it's become this sort of immemorial song of the Armenian diaspora because of what this of what the lyrics are. And after the genocide, I think it became even more established as sort of the anthem of the dispersion. So I'm saying a lot of things that to a lot of people are very well known, and this is not new information necessarily, but just to give some context and around Zabel and who she was. And I think the fact that her version was so beloved, even though Prof. Kalfayan thought that it was alla turca, whatever that means in his mind, there is some vocal stylings in it that maybe he thought were alla turca, but I mean, she's singing in a classical style. She's not singing with some Oriental instruments or something, which a lot of Armenians did and still do, and which I myself do. But it's kind of bizarre to me. Prof. Kalfayan was known as a pretty pompous guy, and some of the information that Ian shared came originally from William Saroyan's memoirs, because Prof. Kalfayan settled in Fresno, and he was the choir master of Holy Trinity Church in Fresno. And Saroyan, as a child, actually took singing classes with him or whatever, and knew him personally, and just thought he was a jerk, just like everyone else in Fresno apparently did. So, although Saroyan also admired his staunch Armenian patriotism. So basically, yeah, so where I was going with this was the version of gurung was obviously really popular. Ian mentioned the story by Hago Pasadurian, the people playing it in the park on their phonograph records. A lot of people had the record. My great-grandparents had the record. I've seen it everywhere. Interestingly, because of the second inferior version that was created on a speeded up version, that was the only unbroken version I had in my great-grandparents' record collection. So it was the first one I heard, and I was kind of like, I don't know about this song. Then, so with Ian's work, I heard the original, and I realized, the greatness of it. So we're all indebted to that. So I just wanted to say that I think she represented an era, and I think it's very interesting to see how she faded. Already by 1932, at the Democratic National Convention, where Franklin Roosevelt was nominated for president of the United States, and of course he then won and then was there for 4 terms. At that convention, they had an Armenian lady singer get up and sing the national anthem, which for an immigrant person to be doing this at the time signified, the FDR coalition of immigrants and different, groups, working class and whatever. And they had an Armenian lady singer do it, but it was not Zabelle Panosian. It was another lady, Rose Zulalian, who was a very nice singer, but seems to me that if Zabel wasn't being asked to do that, and she's the voice of the Armenians, Zulalian didn't even really have any records. So it's kind of like Zabel's career had kind of come to an end at that point. I think that was really the signifier for me. Others may disagree with me, that's fine, but that was the sort of red flag for me. And very, dedicated to the Armenian community in her later years, gives all her money to AGBU. We see she sings at other events. She's sort of associated with the diocese / Ramgavar / pro-Soviet Armenia. Some of her brothers are communists. So, and then she's singing at some events that are related to people in that circle. Gomidas Sidal, who was a pro-communist writer. But then also that's allied with the AGBU, which is like sort of the bourgeois Armenian, and Ramgavar, which is like and we all know the history of why that was. We don't need to get into that right now. So, but she was a person who was a servant of the community, I think. And so she left a legacy that has been forgotten, unfortunately. And I think it's high time that we've remembered it and brought it back. So with that, oh, and I want to say one other thing. I forgot about this. So in the third version of this Yerkaran that I told you, this songbook that I told you had 3 different printings coming from before, and then the last one was after the genocide. There's a section in the back with sheet music, and it says, it has a picture of Zabel here, and it basically says this sheet music has been transcribed from the singing of Zabel by this gentleman here. His name is Arakelian. And so that's how we have these songs. But it was a marketing scheme, because in the first version, which is before the genocide, which is before she had a career, it's just a picture of Arakelian and without a picture of Zabel. So they're using her image as a picture to depict that this is who's going to sing the authentic Armenian folk style and who we've copied down our songs from. And I also think maybe because there was a little bit of a hint that she was a hometown girl, Shah Muradian, who was the great famous tenor who she appeared in concert with, and she was sort of second only to him. He was from the Paris Grand Opera. He was this European celebrity, and she was this young Armenian bride in Boston who took singing lessons somehow and became a singer. And even though she said the Boston Opera Company, I think people knew that she was like the hometown girl, and that's but who's from Armenia and represents the Western Armenian experience of immigration, and then of what's happening back at home that needs to be taken care of, and saving the orphans. So with that, I think I've said enough. I was a little disorganized. I apologize. It's my first time speaking in a Zoom lecture. So for that, I'm going to give it over to Harout for the pictures I believe he's going to do.
Hello, thank you, Harry, for that. And I want to start by thanking the Armenian Institute again for inviting us and giving us this opportunity to speak about Zabel. And I want to thank you all for tuning in. Give me just a moment to share my screen. Okay. So this first image is a full spread that Ian and Harry both discussed earlier from the Veratsunut. This is her interaction with Gomidas Photographic. Zabel's career in entertainment was well documented during her most active and most busy years. And while this was a product of shared research, Mai was really tasked with photographic research. And what's represented in the book is a mixture of information found in newspapers, publications, as well as it includes some of Ian's outreach as well, particularly with personal photos and images related to Adrina's entertainment career. Our book consists of 50 photos, which more than half were published in an assortment of publications. And if my count is accurate, we incorporated images from at least 10 different Armenian language publications. And this here is just some items related to Zabel just from the year 1915 alone. And there was a lot more coverage, but we sought information from any avenue that was available to us. And we also did our best to ensure and validate all the information that we presented. Prior to looking into the Armenian publications, the research really began with American newspaper resources. And immediately it was pretty obvious that Zabel was a popular entertainer. And countless times when we saw an article about her in a newspaper, it was accompanied with photographs. So from these newspaper sources and genealogical resources, we started to get like a really good understanding of her life and career over the years. A great and vital resource that we utilized for the book, which I'm immensely thankful for, is a digitally accessible newspaper archive at the National Library of Armenia. I was able to download and search through an enormous number of predominantly Armenian language publications. And some of these, both Harry and Ian discussed during their portions. For example, the Hagian article Harry mentioned, and the one to the left, the far one, 1986, is actually Zabel's obituary. We were also fortunate to use a Haidanic archives when that was introduced a couple of years ago. And it was interesting because by the time the Haidanic archive was launched, we were fairly complete with our story. But it was still, and it still is, it was then and it still is exciting to encounter new information and validate the information that we already had. As I said, we gathered information and images from a variety of sources, be it from obscure books with one-line references or Shahan Natalie's publication running long articles about Zabel. Columbia Records also used Zabel's likeliness in published advertisements. And there was a number of catalogs that Columbia published, 1920, for example, which talks about Zabel and her available music. And as Harry was talking, I was also looking at the 1930 Columbia Records catalog, which only has one Zabel Panosian record listed, as opposed to the 1921, which had numerous of recordings of her. What we noticed, or what we saw, was that when a photograph of Zabel was run in a newspaper or periodical, it usually included an article, and that article made mention of either a concert that took place or one that was upcoming. And these elements of information enabled us to track Zabel's story. Nearly every Armenian language item can be corroborated with a similar item in an American or English language newspaper. And her star was bright. She was a constant star during her most active years. And this slide is just a small assortment of productions that she was involved in after her return from Europe. The first item in the upper corner is from the Audiv newspaper. This was when she was still in Europe. The Audiv newspaper was based out of Cairo, and it's a review of her concert in Italy. The rest of the items are from the 1920s. I believe specifically 24 to 27. Looking at the life of Zabel Panosian, it's been a really exciting adventure. And allow me to give a moment just to give one example. Chapter 9 makes mention of a 1939 event celebrating the actor Setrag Surabyan. Now, by the end of last year, 2021, Ian was pretty complete with the text. We were at the finish line. At the same time, I began preparing my notes for a talk on January 28th for the Armenian Institute, a program that was called Music Without Borders. And in that story, I focused on the career of Masha Surabyan, Setrag's wife. And all of a sudden, in building that story, I see an article in the Gochnak Weekly Press that Zabel was in attendance for that Jubilee event, giving a speech and a gift to Setrag Surabyan. And it's a connection we all felt was quite important. I should mention that the Surabyans helped launch the Sohag record label in 1923-24, New York City. And the Surabyans were contemporaries of Zabel, though we really didn't have them crossing paths until this article from 39 was published. So it helped us a lot. Somewhere in the book, Ian pens something that I really appreciated, and I won't state where it is, if it's in the middle, end, or the beginning of the book. I don't want to give away any spoilers, but to paraphrase Ian's sentiment, the book's been published and it's out now. It's accessible to people. And I can only hope that Zabel's story inspires a future record collector or future researcher, and I'm excited for the unknowns that'll be discovered in the future. So thank you. It was let me close this. Sorry about that. Thank you again. And that's pretty much my short portion. Back to you, Ian.
All right, you guys want to do some questions?
Okay. Well, thank you all. I think I'll be speaking for everyone to say it was such an emotional journey with Zabelle, and so much musical, historical, literary background. Thank you so much, Ian, for
Thank you very much for having us.
What a detailed story. And Harry, I think what you added was much needed historic and literary background, and so much incredible detail only you would know. And Harout, you just really made everything come alive with your research. I think some questions and comments are coming through, but just because I'm the host, I can ask the first question. And if I allowed, without spoilers, like Harout said, read 2-3 sentences from the book, from the prologue actually, which Ian describes his first encounter with Zabelle's voice, which is so poetic, so poetic. Can I, Ian, with your permission, I'll read just a tiny bit. He's describing the first moment he heard Zabelle's voice going through stack of vinyls from a gentleman called Leo, I cannot find the surname.
Kezelian.
Okay, of course, you know, now you're the expert with Armenian surname. So he says a record, an orange label climbed a disc labeled Grung by one Zabelle Panosian. Like a man with a metal detector sweeping the landscape, my desire for a connection to a singer began to scream as I heard a voice that came out of a grinding hiss of a side that was worn grey and cracked laterally from the spindle hole to the edge. And then, about a minute into the side, she hit and held that knot. And then you continue that my mind went blank, the EKG flatlined, and I went to heaven. What an intro. I mean, I opened your book and you couldn't find a better recommendation that I flatlined and went to heaven. Is this, just wanted to ask, is this a unique, was this a unique experience? You must have heard thousands and thousands of records in your life and collect, but this seems more special than the others, am I right?
It's more special than the ones you put the needle on and begin with a piano and a string quartet. Because generally, when you hear a piano and a string quartet, you're going to hear some middle-class stuff. And it's somebody who has aspiring middle-class beliefs and values. And those generally are not going to be very interesting to me because I'm looking for heights of experience. I'm looking for high highs and low lows and something that is powerful emotionally to me, somebody who doesn't read or speak anything other than English. But there is something about a voice when you hear it come from a record. It's very intimate. It is a column of breath that runs in and out of you all day long, every day. And when you hear somebody sing, you know whether they're kidding you or not, whether they're doing this for some reason of trying to be noticed or famous or significant or, you know, to boost themselves up somehow, or whether they're telling you the truth, whether they're speaking from inside themselves, something that matters to them. And Zabelle, clearly, what she was doing mattered to her immensely. So it was just incredible. David Harrington from the Kronos Quartet once wrote that Zabelle Panosian sang one of the most beautiful notes he'd ever heard in his life, and that when he writes his novel, the main character in the novel will be Zabelle's note, because it carries inside of it everything important about being a human being.
How wonderful, how wonderful. There are lots of thanks and kind words about your talk. And there's a question from Cara Berberian who is asking that Zabelle's Wikipedia says In 1931, Columbia deleted its Armenian language catalog, including her works. Why and how did this happen? I don't know who.
I wrote the Wikipedia page.
Okay.
It was
Okay.
it was already there, and then when the book came out, I was like, oh, I'm just going to fix all the mistakes, because all the mistakes were drawn from earlier things I had written. Because it's been years I've been writing about her, and I've gotten some stuff wrong over the years. So I just went back and I just fixed everything. Anyway, 1931, when the stock market crash happens in 29, Columbia and Victor, who had begun recording immigrants, ethnic records, foreign language records, non-English language records, in about 1908, 1909, 1910, realized that that was not where they were making their money from. And they reorganized and consolidated their business so that they would just be releasing records they knew they could make money from. And in the process, these smaller, numerically, population-wise, demographically, smaller immigrant ethnic groups, they just deleted the catalogs. So Arabic, Turkish, Armenian, that all went. They just stopped releasing that stuff because it was never big sellers. There just wasn't enough of a market for it. They, in fact, cut way down drastically on Italian and Greek and Spanish language material, for whom there was a much larger potential demographic to buy the records. A handful of Greeks recorded for Columbia in the 1930s, and Greeks represented a vastly larger population than Armenians did in the United States. Yeah, it's just a function of the record business during the Depression. Oh, also radios. You just buy a radio, turn it on, and there's music. So why would you be spending all this money on records? Because records were 75 cents to $1 for a 10-inch disc. You get 6 minutes of music. That in 1925 terms it's about $15 now. It's about the same as a CD, right? The record business realized that there was a price point that people would pay for a record, and they have just increased the duration over time. How much does a Spotify account cost every month? It's about $10. That's about how much people will pay. You just keep adding more duration. 45s, LPs, CDs, more and more time, same price point. Now, a 12-inch disc is $1.25 in 1925, which, roughly today, that's between $20 and $25. So that's an expensive luxury item. And that's why Zabel's records, they did this speeding up thing with the later take of Grunk, was they were condensing what should have been a 12-inch disc to fit onto a 10-inch format, because they realized that Armenians wouldn't pay more than 85 cents for a record. And they knew that because they released a 12-inch disc by Shamaradian, and that disc did not sell. Or it didn't sell in anywhere near the numbers that his earlier 10-inch discs did. Highest End, his greatest hit, just sold like crazy, thousands and thousands and thousands of copies, as did Grunk. But then they put out this 12-inch disc. It's hard to find the one 12-inch he made. So when they went to release Zabel's 12 inches, they were like, it's good enough to release and we can make money on it for sure, but there's no way Armenians are going to pay $1.25. So anyway, long answer to a question. It's all record business stuff, is the short answer.
Thank you. It sounds like a financial, economic decision. Thank you so much, Ian, for sharing the links to the book and the CD in the chat. Please, everyone, pay attention. Here's the wonderful, wonderful book. It's tiny, but there's so much information and passion and heart packed into this book. It made me teary many, many times. And if you please buy it, it comes with a beautiful orange CD. I just realized the connection, an orange CD of Zabel's beautiful voice. Or if you are based in London, come to Armenian Institute Library and you can sit and read and tell us your impression. My colleague Nani also shared the feedback form. I know it's boring, but please spend a minute, fill it in so we can tell our founders what a wonderful job we're doing. And a quick question for Harout and Harry possibly as well, because how come, I mean, Ian talked at length that she went into this obscurity. She just disappeared, like Kathy Berberian said, that she faded. I think that's the word she used. Have there been any attempts before you? Given her incredibly generous donation to AGBU, you think there would have been more work or more interest?
May I address this just momentarily before the other two do? There's a significant point related to this, which is that Zabel's sister had children, whereas her daughter did not. And Zabel's sister's children knew her, and the closest living descendant to Zabel Panosian is on the talk right now, and contributed a photograph and some stories to the book. So I just wanted to, Varojan Karats, who's here and contributed this extraordinary photograph. We became in touch because I wrote an article for the Armenian Weekly some years back lamenting that Zabel was not thought about or paid attention to. He saw the article, contacted me, and pointed out to me that even though he had met her, he never knew that she had a singing career.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That is incredible.
And now I think that the other two are best suited to address the center of your question.
I'd like to say that, no, there was no work, research, or anything prior to what we did. There were some old, Varojan Karats has said something.
If he'd like to make a statement, I think we turn over the mic to him if he's up for it.
Absolutely.
Yes, Varojan, I'm trying to unmute you if you'd like to join us, say a few things. Yeah.
Because I've never spoken with.
He also wrote a great history book of Rhode Island.
Hello.
I'm really totally fascinated with what I've seen and what I've heard. You really can't imagine. I mean, this is I was sort of jotting down here that I'm probably the only person alive that touched her and
I think it's froze, but
Oh dear.
I think you can read Varojan's comment in the chat, which is so moving. I think something happened.
I want to text Varojan and.
Nope.
Ah.
You're back.
Varojan, sorry, you cut out.
oh, I see the note here. It says that the internet connection was not very well. So is my interconnection. But as I was saying, I probably am the only person that ever still alive that's touched her and corresponded with her and visited her. And although my sister and I, who by the way, she passed away this past December, were visited with her when we were children. In my later years, we corresponded periodically. She's a lovely woman, but we really didn't know the fact that she was so popular. I think we were aware of the fact that she was a singer, but we really never got the details relative to all of this that you people have put together. Absolutely amazing. I mean, just, you've opened up a new world to us, and we want to thank you, gentlemen, that put it all together. It's just a fabulous thing that you've done. And we certainly would like to see that published in some way and promoted more, and to get into the files of other Armenians that Zabel, what she did, how she did it, and what she brought to brought to everybody, not only the people that listen to her records, but to the organizations that were involved with her. Once again, thank you. I can't get over it. I'm sorry my sister is not here, but I see that my daughter, Deneb Kadens, is well, looking at all this and viewing it as well, and we'll be talking about it later on. So thanks again, and as I say, I'm overcome of how well you've done this whole program for her.
Thank you so much. It's so nice to see you.
Thank you, Varjan. So moving to have you here, like you say, someone who knew her in person. She's like a fairy tale princess for most of us.
Thank you, Varjan. I'm so glad that we were able to bring this back for you and bring to light all this information about your beloved aunt. It's very special to be able to give that back to somebody who it means to personally. And I'm glad you liked what we did. I'm happy you liked it.
Let me just mention that I did have an opportunity to go to Bad Zizag, where she came from. I witnessed the past locations of the two churches that were there. My mother also, obviously from Bad Zizag, was a school teacher who taught there, and just bringing a new person that was a success of that village. It was just outstanding. So, what a present I've had today. It's like a gift that came out of heaven. Thanks again.
Thank you.
You're
Thank
very
you.
welcome.
Thanks for joining us, Varjan. Thank you.
I was going to make a comment that no, nobody has studied this prior to us in terms of the way we did it. The only references I've seen were, and Ian included them in the book, references from people that were old enough to kind of remember who she was, and maybe included her in I think Armenian-American included her in an article about a bunch of different singers and sort of mentioned her name, and okay, and then the next era was this other person, and sort of in passing, other people mentioned, Hago Pasadorian mentioned, oh, we listened to her records. People who were that old, older than Varjan definitely, knew who she was at the time, but so much of early American Armenian history was forgotten. And it's not just Zabel. In fact, almost any of the recording artists who recorded on records in the 1920s in the United States. And by the way, from the time of the genocide until the mid-1930s, the United States and New York in particular, New York, New Jersey area was absolutely the most prolific area of recorded music of Armenian music, or Armenian musicians also singing Turkish and other languages. Because in Turkey, it was shut down. In the Soviet Union, all recording was shut down. So there was it was the US, and France had some, but basically the US had an unbelievable amount. And almost none of these artists are still talked about today, except for, maybe there's some Kef musicians that will talk about, oh, there was this oud player or whatever, in a very small niche circle of people that know about it. And even most of the time, what they're talking about is from the 40s, not from the 20s. And then Shamuradian is really remembered as like a figure, not so much his actual recordings. It took Harout Arakelian, the son of Udist Richard Hagopian, who is a classically trained violinist, to say, well, there's these recordings of Gomidas's actual voice and also Shamuradian. Why don't we reissue that on CD? And nobody had done this even in Hayastan, which is kind of crazy to think about. Now, recently, I've seen, coming from official archives in Hayastan, very nice cleaned up version of some of Shamuradian's songs. So I'm happy that they're doing that now. But I guess my point is, a lot of this early recording, music recording stuff, people just didn't seem to care. It didn't matter if it was the most amazing person ever, or if it was just somebody's uncle. They just didn't seem to care about this era in any way. So unless you were one of these guys, there's a handful of people, Richard Hagopian, Ara Dingshin, and these other basically have musicians that have these stacks of records in their basement, and I have them now, and Harout has them now, and Ian has them now, and they know who Zabel is, and they're like, oh yeah, but they're oud players, they're talking about that music, and so they got enough on their plate, you know. I think Ara Dingshan mentioned something to Harout, like, oh, I'm glad you guys are doing this. Maybe eventually people will realize, you know, what Zabel did. But I mean, they're so busy trying to bring back that whole era, which is so prolific. You know, Zabel's one of many, one of the greatest of the many, but it's just sort of, that whole era has fallen through the cracks, I think, and definitely with music, it's fallen through the cracks.
You're right, but what you've done is just phenomenal, because you not only revived her music, but I cannot imagine even how much research went into it. All these little cuttings Harout had his in presentation. I can imagine the hours went to track them down and catalog, and I hope one day there will be an archive at the Armenian Institute. We have some amazing archives, so we appreciate the importance of them so much. But Harout, you mentioned something when you were ending your talk, how important it is to find new voices, to rediscover these untold stories, unheard stories. How do we make sure that this doesn't remain a one-off treasure? How do we ensure more work is happening? How the community, everyone who is on this call, can support you?
I don't know the answer to that. We're hopeful, right? We've published a book, but I think individually we'll all still, for the decades to come, always have this thing that we're looking for more information on Zabel. But in a way, it's up to the future, right? And it probably won't be us. It'll be another record collector that picks up this record, the experience that Ian had, the experience that I've had with Zabel's music. Somebody else will have that too. They'll find this old obscure record and they'll put it on their record player and say, what is this sound? You know, and they'll be inspired by it as well, because this music has survived for over 100 years. I know that's not a great answer to the question, but I'm hopeful that we can continue to preserve it and nurture it and share it and hear it and be inspired by it, by Zabel and her contemporaries.
Hope is a very good place to start, Harout. Let's start with that. Where, even in our small archives, we've recently made a discovery. My colleague, our archivist, Dr. Shaika Erkanan, we realized that Misha Kudian, a prominent translator whose archives we hold his wife's archive, who was a very famous piano player in this country. So we're trying to discover, recover, find her recordings from BBC. She played and toured widely. So we'll be in touch with you when we find some records. How do you keep picking up records? You've got to show us.
I was thinking of showing this one, which actually Ian just sent to me. This is a home, and what you were just describing, this is basically a home recording. You might find home recordings in that collection, which are very important, because you'll be surprised by what the information is on there. It could be a master musician practicing, or it could be a child at home reciting a poem. These are really interesting. I'm sorry, as you were just describing that popped into my
mind. One of the questions about preservation and dissemination of music that might be, as somebody who is not Armenian, valuable to consider is that the music is very good and will speak to anyone with ears, and that it should not be contained simply within the Armenian community, but that it is for the world. It is a contribution to world culture. My work is mainly addressed to the United States. I think Zabelle Panosian will be on a postage stamp one day as an American. I think she made an enormous contribution, and I think that it will be understood and appreciated by lots and lots of people. And I think that publishing, putting this stuff out there, making it available, people will come find it.
to
For
follow
what
up
it's worth.
on that point, maybe one of the reasons why forgotten is the word that we use with Zabel is just what Ian said, publishing. Armenag Shamuradian's music was in circulation constantly. Almost every decade there was a compilation album of his music put out. The Darun Association, just random
Melodia.
LPs. Melodia did it as well, and then in the LP era, his music was published. One of their contemporaries that we haven't mentioned is Torkum Bezesian, who actually recorded before Zabel and Armenag, and more prolifically. He recorded over 100 songs for Columbia, Victor, Edison, and the OK Laughing Company. Well over 100 songs starting in February of 1915 through 1925, but his music was never republished. And his lore or the aura of his name is not the same as Zabel. So, you know, he's almost forgotten. I don't like using the word forgotten because I remember these musicians every day when I look at my collection. So I don't think they're really forgotten. There's somebody else out there that has an extensive collection, as we all do, and listen to these musicians. But I think it's publishing and making the music available. So if somebody doesn't hear Zabel Panosian's music for 100 years, if it's not available or accessible, they're not really going to remember the name. So I think that's one thing we can do, is just make all this music accessible, available. Let whoever wants to listen to it have the opportunity to hear it. Hopefully they're inspired.
Yeah.
Tell stories. Talk.
Yeah, fortunately, we live in an era when digital and online tools allow us to do that, and we try to do it at the Armenian Institute as much as we can, whether it's putting our library catalog online, digitizing books, digitizing archives, and we have a giant record stack, and I hope one of you or all of you will visit one day and go through them and tell us what to do with it. But we're coming up to, well, 8 o'clock here, and this has been so enjoyable, and I keep seeing wonderful comments coming through the chat and the feedback form, and congratulations again to all three of you for exceptional, phenomenal work you've done. I will urge everyone on this call, please go to Ian's camera records and lose yourself in music, not just Zabel. It's extraordinary. And I think you have a new subscription system as well, and subscribe. Yeah.
Yeah, buy the book.
Buy
I
the
have
book.
650 of them that nobody will distribute.
Buy the book.
Buy
Spread
the book.
the word. Buy the book. Spread the word. Tell your friends. Keep in touch with the Armenian Institute. We have more fantastic events coming up soon. My program manager will correct me if I'm wrong, but we have a book on display on 26th of July with our fantastic librarian Harout Arakelian, A Medieval Tale of an Armenian Georgian Princess. And on 28th of July, we have a poetry open mic. So anyone who likes poetry, your own poetry, reads poetry, enjoys poetry, just join and read whatever you want. And subscribe to our newsletter. Thank you very much, everyone, again, and thanks to my colleagues for all their help. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.